The Soldier Who Wouldn't Surrender. The 29-Year War of Hiroo Onoda. On March 9, 1974, a Japanese Imperial Army officer emerged from the Philippine jungle and formally surrendered to his commanding officer. 29 years after World War II had ended, he was still in uniform, still carrying his rifle, and still fighting a war that the rest of the world had forgotten. When we think of World War II, we imagine a clear ending. August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that marked the conclusion of history's deadliest conflict. VJ Day celebrations erupted across the Allied world. Soldiers came home. The rubble was cleared. Tribunals were held. Nations began the long work of rebuilding. The war was over. Except for one man, it wasn't. Second Lieutenant Hiroo Onoda, stationed on the remote Philippine island of Lubang, did not believe the war had ended. For nearly 3 decades, he continued his guerrilla campaign against an enemy that had long since stopped fighting, killed dozens of Filipino farmers and police officers who he believed were enemy combatants, and became one of the most wanted men in the Philippines, all while following orders that had been obsolete for a generation. This is not a story about heroism or glory. This is a story about what happens when absolute devotion to duty collides with a reality that has moved on without you. It's a story about the psychological power of indoctrination, the tragedy of misplaced loyalty, and the question of what happens when a soldier becomes so committed to a mission that he cannot recognize when that mission has become meaningless. This is the story of Hiroo Onoda, the man who fought World War II into the 1970s. The making of a holdout, Hiroo Onoda was born in 1922 in Wakayama Prefecture, Japan, into a country already marching toward militarism and imperial expansion. By the time he came of age, Japanese society had fully embraced Bushido, the samurai code that emphasized honor, loyalty, absolute obedience, and the belief that surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Death before dishonor wasn't just a saying, it was national policy. In 1942, as the Pacific War intensified, Onoda was conscripted into the Imperial Japanese Army. He was bright, capable, and ideologically committed, exactly the kind of soldier the empire needed. Rather than being sent to the front lines, he was selected for training in guerrilla warfare and intelligence operations at the Nakano School, an elite institution that taught unconventional warfare tactics, survival skills, espionage, and psychological resistance to enemy propaganda. The training was brutal and comprehensive. Students learned to survive on minimal rations, to move invisibly through hostile territory, to maintain their mission regardless of circumstances, and, most critically, to disbelieve enemy propaganda. They were taught that the enemy would use every trick imaginable to convince Japanese soldiers that the war was lost, that surrender was acceptable, that the emperor had given up. These were all lies, they were told. Never believe them, never surrender, fight until death or until personally ordered to stand down by a superior officer. This training would prove to be simultaneously the making and the unmaking of Hiroo Onoda, the mission on Lubang. In December 1944, Onoda was sent to Lubang Island in the Philippines with explicit orders from his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi. The orders were clear and uncompromising. You are absolutely forbidden to die by your own hand. It may take 3 years, it may take 5, but whatever happens, we'll come back for you. Until then, so long as you have one soldier, you are to continue to lead him. You may have to live on coconuts. If that's the case, live on coconuts. Under no circumstances are you to give up your life voluntarily. The mission was to conduct guerrilla operations against Allied forces, to disrupt their operations, to destroy infrastructure, and to make the island as difficult to hold as possible. It was a suicide mission in all but name, except that suicide was explicitly forbidden. Onoda was ordered to survive and continue fighting no matter what. By February 1945, American forces had retaken Lubang. Most Japanese soldiers on the island were killed or captured. A handful escaped into the jungle. Onoda was among them, along with 3 other soldiers, Private Yuichi Akatsu, Corporal Shoichi Shimada, and Private First Class Kinshichi Kozuka. These 4 men retreated into the mountains and jungles of Lubang and prepared for a long guerrilla campaign. They expected the Japanese military to retake the island eventually. They expected the war to continue for years. They did not expect to be forgotten. The first decade, 1945 to 1955. As 1945 turned into 1946, the 4 holdouts began to realize that rescue was not imminent. But this did not shake their resolve. They had been trained for exactly this scenario. They knew the enemy would drop propaganda leaflets claiming the war was over. They knew psychological operations would be employed to trick them into surrendering. They were prepared for this, and indeed, leaflets began appearing in the jungle. "The war is over," they read. "Japan has surrendered. Come out peacefully." Some leaflets included copies of newspapers with headlines about the surrender. Others contained personal messages from family members begging the holdouts to come home. Onoda and his companions studied these leaflets carefully and concluded they were obvious fakes. The reasoning seemed sound to them. The language was slightly off. Not quite how official Japanese communications would be phrased. The Emperor's surrender broadcast described in the leaflets seemed impossible. The Emperor would never surrender. If Japan had really surrendered, why wasn't the island swarming with enemy troops? Why would the enemy want them to surrender unless they posed a genuine threat? By this logic, the very existence of the leaflets proved they were doing their job effectively. The enemy wanted them to surrender precisely because their guerrilla operations were working, so they continued fighting. They raided farms for food, burned rice stores to deny the enemy supplies, shot at Filipino farmers they believed were enemy soldiers or collaborators, and maintained strict military discipline in their jungle hideout. In 1950, Private Akatsu could take no more. The psychological strain, the constant hunger, the endless paranoia, it broke him. He slipped away one night and surrendered to Filipino authorities. When Onoda, Shimada, and Kozuka heard about this, they didn't see it as a sign that perhaps the war really was over. They saw it as weakness, as betrayal. Akatsu had broken under enemy psychological warfare. They would not. The 3 remaining holdouts became even more cautious, even more committed, even more isolated. The second decade, 1955 to 1965 years passed. The Korean War came and went. Surely, the 3 men thought, this was connected to Japan's ongoing struggle against the Allies. The world was changing rapidly. Television became common. Commercial jet travel began. Rock and roll emerged. Independence movements swept across Asia and Africa. On Lubang Island, 3 Japanese soldiers lived as if it was still 1944. They moved camps regularly, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. They maintained their weapons meticulously, a remarkable feat, given that they had no replacement parts and no oil except what they could improvise from coconuts. They rationed their ammunition carefully, knowing every bullet had to count. They grew leaner, harder, more feral. Occasionally, they clashed with Filipino civilians and police. From the holdouts' perspective, these were legitimate military engagements. From the Filipinos' perspective, they were terrorist attacks by Japanese stragglers who refused to accept reality. People died in these encounters. Filipino farmers protecting their land, police officers trying to stop what they saw as bandits. In 1952, the Japanese government officially declared the holdouts dead. Their families held funerals. Their names were added to war memorials. As far as official records were concerned, they had died serving the emperor in 1945. But on Lubang, they were very much alive and still fighting. More leaflets dropped, more messages from family members, more newspapers showing a peaceful, prosperous Japan. Onoda analyzed each one and found reasons to doubt. The paper quality was wrong. The photographs looked staged. Why would the enemy go to such elaborate lengths unless the holdouts were a genuine strategic threat? The breaking point, October 19th, 1972. On October 19th, 1972, nearly 27 years after Japan's surrender, tragedy struck the holdout camp. Corporal Shimada and Lieutenant Onoda were on a reconnaissance patrol when they encountered a Filipino search party. Gunfire erupted. When the smoke cleared, Shimada lay dead. Now there were 2, Onoda and Kozuka. Shimada's death briefly made international news. The story of Japanese soldiers still fighting World War II in the 1970s captured public imagination. How was this possible? Why hadn't they been found? The Japanese government sent more search parties, dropped more leaflets, broadcast messages from loudspeakers. Onoda's own brother traveled to Lubang and shouted messages into the jungle, begging Hiroo to come home. Onoda heard his brother's voice. He recognized it. But he also remembered his training. The enemy would use every psychological trick, including impersonating family members. He and Kozuka stayed hidden. The final casualty, October 1974. On October 19th, 1974, exactly 2 years after Shimada's death, disaster struck again. Kozuka and Onoda were raiding a rice field when police opened fire. Kozuka was killed instantly. Now, Hiroo Onoda was alone, the last holdout, the sole survivor of a mission that had started with 4 men nearly 30 years earlier. He was 52 years old, living in the jungle, still wearing the tattered remains of his Imperial Army uniform, still carrying his Arisaka rifle, still fighting World War II. But something had changed. For the first time, Onoda began to seriously consider that perhaps, the war might actually be over. The student who wouldn't give up. This is where the story takes its strangest turn. In February 1974, a young Japanese university dropout named Norio Suzuki decided to go searching for 3 things: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman, in that order. He was an adventurer and idealist, part of the 1970s generation that rejected conventional paths and sought meaning through unusual quests. Suzuki traveled to Lubang with minimal supplies and no real plan. Where trained military search parties had failed for decades, this eccentric 24-year-old succeeded within days. He simply wandered through the jungle calling out that he came as a friend, that he wanted to meet the famous Lieutenant Onoda, that he meant no harm. On February 20th, 1974, Onoda, cautious and suspicious, approached Suzuki's camp. The young man showed no fear. They talked. Suzuki explained that the war had been over for 29 years, that Japan had recovered and was now a prosperous democracy, that the world had changed completely. Onoda listened politely, but remained unconvinced. Finally, he told Suzuki, "I will not surrender unless I receive orders from my commanding officer." This was the breakthrough. After 29 years, someone finally understood what Onoda needed. Not more leaflets, not more pleas from family, orders from his superior officer, following the chain of command exactly as he'd been trained. The surrender, March 9th, 1974. Suzuki returned to Japan and tracked down Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, now a civilian bookseller, 72 years old, living a quiet life. The former commanding officer was stunned to learn that Onoda was alive and still following the orders given in 1944. On March 9, 1974, Taniguchi traveled to Lubang Island. Filipino authorities declared a temporary amnesty. Onoda, notified through intermediaries, emerged from the jungle in full uniform, his rifle immaculately maintained, his sword at his side, standing at rigid attention. Major Taniguchi, wearing civilian clothes and looking every bit the elderly bookseller he had become, read the orders. In accordance with the Imperial Command, the 14th Area Army has ceased all combat activity. In accordance with Military Headquarters Command Order Number A-2003, the Special Squadron of Staff's headquarters is relieved of all military duties. Units and individuals under the command of Special Squadron are to cease military activities and operations immediately and place themselves under the command of the nearest superior officer. When the senior officer is not to be found, they are to communicate with the American or Philippine forces and follow their directives. Onoda saluted. He formally surrendered his sword, his rifle, which still worked perfectly, 500 rounds of ammunition, several hand grenades, and his orders from 1944, carefully preserved for 29 years. The war was finally over. The aftermath and reckoning Onoda returned to a Japan he didn't recognize. The nation he had left in 1944 was a militaristic empire convinced of its divine destiny. The Japan of 1974 was a pacifist democracy, an economic powerhouse, a close ally of the United States. The emperor was no longer a living god but a constitutional figurehead. The Bushido code that had defined Onoda's worldview was now seen as a relic of a discredited era. He was treated as a celebrity initially, the ultimate loyal soldier, the man who never gave up. But the celebration was complicated. Onoda's decades-long guerrilla campaign had killed approximately 30 Filipino civilians and wounded over 100 others. These were real people with families, farmers, and police officers who died decades after the war ended, victims of a conflict that existed only in one man's mind. The Filipino government, under intense diplomatic pressure from Japan, granted Onoda a pardon, but the families of his victims felt differently. They saw not a loyal soldier, but a killer who had refused to accept reality. The moral questions were thorny. Was Onoda a hero or a tragedy? Was he following orders or committing murder? Where is the line between duty and delusion? Onoda himself struggled with reintegration. He found 1970s Japan shallow and weak, obsessed with materialism and lacking the spiritual discipline he valued. In 1975, he emigrated to Brazil, where he started a cattle ranch and lived in relative isolation. He wrote a memoir, No Surrender, My 30-Year War, which became an international bestseller. In 1984, he returned to Lubang Island to donate $10,000 to a local school as a gesture of apology. He periodically returned to Japan to speak about his experiences, always maintaining that he had simply followed his orders and done his duty as a soldier. Hiroo Onoda died in Tokyo on January 16, 2014, at the age of 91. He never expressed regret for his actions, believing to the end that he had served honorably according to the code he was taught. What this story reveals: Onoda's 29-year war illuminates several disturbing truths. The power of indoctrination. Onoda's training was so thorough, so psychologically complete, that he literally could not accept evidence that contradicted his mission. He was the perfect soldier, and that was precisely the problem. The psychology of commitment. Once committed to a course of action, humans find it extraordinarily difficult to admit they might be wrong, especially when that commitment has cost them so much. Each year Onoda spent in the jungle made it harder to accept that those years might have been wasted. The victims of obedience. While Onoda is often portrayed sympathetically as a devoted soldier, we cannot forget the Filipino civilians killed by a man fighting a war that no longer existed. Duty without reason becomes atrocity. The cost of Bushido. The samurai code that made Onoda seem heroic also made him unable to adapt to reality. Absolute loyalty, taken to its logical extreme, becomes indistinguishable from madness. The nature of reality. Onoda's story raises philosophical questions about belief and evidence. When does skepticism become denial? How do we know when to trust our training versus our observations? What happens when our worldview becomes unfalsifiable? The last word. Hiroo Onoda fought World War II for 29 years, 3 months, and 22 days. He survived when thousands didn't, remained loyal when others surrendered, and followed his orders long after those orders ceased to have any meaning. History will debate whether he was a hero or a cautionary tale. Perhaps he was both. His story reminds us that the qualities we admire in wartime, loyalty, determination, unwavering commitment, can become destructive when divorced from reason and context. The war ended in 1945, but for one man, it continued until a 72-year-old bookseller stood in a Philippine jungle and finally released him from a duty that had long since ceased to matter. Sometimes the hardest battles to end are not fought on battlefields, but in the minds of soldiers who cannot accept that the fighting is over.